Okay, so I'm really delighted to be here. Last time I interacted with you was online, so I much prefer embodied interactions, and I'm going to say a few words about that today. Before I start, I just want to give you a bit of context. So I'm also a psychotherapist involved in different kinds of interventions based on one concept, mentalizing. So I'm going to talk about that a bit today. If you want to know more about mentalizing, we have a couple of books. I'm going to make the slides available, also an online course, and some events coming up. But what I want really to start with is an acknowledgement for the people that have inspired me to try to work with individuals through telephone. So Katja Schenkel, who's an emergency psychologist, and Stefan Witt, who's our clinical psychologist at the University of Geneva, we've built a whole program called the Psy Line, and it's been quite a learning experience and very interesting for us. Okay, so this is, in a sense, from my schizophrenic brain. I'm trying to both understand the science behind interventions through a phone line, as well as the clinical and human phenomenology and experience of what it is like to go through this process. And in a sense, when a person calls, there is something that is quite tangled up that can actually provoke in the experience of the one receiving the phone call, as well a number of muddled experiences and emotions. And the process is one of trying to find some threads that we can actually identify and work with. And to do that, a useful concept for us is the concept of mentalizing, as formulated by Anthony Bateman and Peter Fonagy. It's really about imagining what is going on in terms of mental states, so in terms of beliefs, desires, emotions, and motivations that bring up this crisis or emergency or need to be calling and having this interaction. And within this, the therapeutic communication, so the communication which seeks to relieve the individual of something or to try to help him out, is really a process. Which perhaps cannot be modeled right now in artificial intelligence. It's a very complex process where co-mentalizing, so mentalizing of the caller and as well as of the person receiving the call. So this process critically will lead to first communication, so the possibility to actually be talking about something common together and building a link, eventually a kind of relationship. Comprehension, so this is the identification of the different threads that augment understanding, and also collaboration. Knowing that it will take two to be able to mentalize. We cannot, we can only go so far in mentalizing on our own. And this is true for the caller, and this is true also for the person receiving the call. And so mentalizing for us is a central vector of the therapeutic communication. And what I'm going to try to transmit to you today is that we think it's based on three main pillars. We think therapeutic communication is based on three main pillars. The first one is a difficult one when we use a phone, is biobehavioral synchrony. The second one will be the mentalizing process, and then I'm going to introduce something that might be new to you, the concept of trust, but a specific kind of trust called epistemic trust. Okay, and what I'll try to argue is that you're using these three pillars in your interventions to build trust and therapeutic communication. So let's start with biobehavioral synchrony. We already talked about it a bit this morning, but I'll take another route here through two concepts by Donald Winnicott, holding and handling. Winnicott said, it's a very interesting thing, a lot of communication goes on within the first year of life, but there's no actual words being spoken, right? And the environment, whether it be the mother, the caretaker, those persons, could be many different persons, but the persons that are consistent will be actually communicating through the way that they hold the baby and through the way that they handle the baby. The third concept is through the way that they present objects to the baby. And if you remember this morning's almost tragic video of this baby with the phone, you could actually think of the fact that there was no interaction where there was any kind of holding physical. There was no handling of the baby, and there was an object presenting and an object taking that was very rapid. And so all of these elements contribute to a dyssynchrony. Winnicott would have called it a not good enough environment that leads to severe and long-term emotion dysregulation problems. In the good enough situation, it doesn't need to be perfect. In fact, psychologists that do this kind of research say, if you get it half of the time right, it's actually very good. The good enough environment will actually install the basic elements of the development of emotion regulation. And Ruth Feldman's work has actually brought this to the neuroscientific level, where holding, handling, but also synchrony, so attunement, occurs at multiple levels. When you look at babies and caregivers interacting, you will be able to identify patterns of behavioral synchrony, and these patterns actually predict positive autonomous self-regulation. Whilst they are playing, if you have the technology, you will also be able to see brain synchrony. So cerebral synchrony within the play interaction. If you give yourself the chance to monitor cardiac rhythms, you will actually see that in this interaction, there will be cardiac synchrony as well. And if you go into the hormonal measurements, you will actually find neuropeptides such as oxytocin, but also stress-related levels such as cortisol being synchronized between caregiver and the baby. So the synchrony that we feel when we're on the phone, and sometimes that we feel disappears, comes back again, is a testimony probably of a multi multi-level interaction within the intersubjective interaction. And research from Ruth Feldman and others show that regular patterns of synchrony will provide the building blocks, in fact, of mental health, such as behavioral adaptations, empathy capacities, reduced accident proneness, and capacity, RSA, is a capacity to regulate all of the stress and physiological responses to danger, to stress, and the like. How does this happen? Through multiple communication vectors. Gaze direction, looking at each other as well as looking in the same direction. Shared positive affect, what we call motherese or baby talk, if you like. Adaptation of tone. All of the people here, I'm sure, use a lot of their tone, of their rhythms when they intervene. And emotional touch, which, as we saw this morning, is very important to integrate multi-sensory experience into a regulated experience, as well as an experience that can be symbolized, which means that can be thought about. Okay, so we're a bit at a disadvantage in the phone line situation because we don't necessarily have the physical presence with the person that is calling. But there are a number of studies that will use rhythmical approaches, that will use indicators of shared emotional experience, that will study these time lags that you intersperse in your intervention to create reflective comments. Essentially, I'm not saying that what you say is not important, but I'm saying that how you say it is actually at least a third or more of the equation of when you're intervening. And so the synchrony at a non-verbal level on a number of different levels is really first and foremost, I think, the way that we engage with individuals, and that is part of therapeutic communication. Again, Ruth Feldman's group just came out with a study showing that indeed we're a bit at a disadvantage when we were using technology. There is reduced brain-to-brain synchrony when we compare face-to-face interactions to video chat interactions. The consequence of this is that, in my opinion, we have even more to increase what we will call as the ostensive communication cues to be able to generate this very fundamental level of therapeutic communication, which is biobehavioral synchrony. I will come back to the idea of ostensive communication cues later in the talk. But what we know is that us, as well as the people calling, will have gone through this synchronies during development, at every stage of development. And violence is probably the most explicit example of this synchrony. This leads to symptoms, resistant symptoms that come back regularly, and also bring in difficulties to activate resources or relate to human beings in one's social environment, and so impossibilities of psychological contact. Unfortunately, we have such ways as telephones to be able to try to reactivate these resources. And so the second way that we engage, we think, in therapeutic communication is through the process of mentalizing. And as I said, mentalizing is about imaginative activity to attend to mental states, our own and that of the caller. But the problem is that what the caller can often go through in their own lives is a set of asynchronies or dysynchronies that are sometimes going to repeat themselves during the phone call. These synchronies, these asynchronies happen in almost every setting, even in a setting where the therapist doesn't talk. It can happen. And so how do we manage this? By attending to mental state information, we will sometimes increase, sometimes decrease the level of our capacity to understand the other and of the other's capacity to attend to our mental states. What we hope that happens during this process is that the trait aspect of mentalizing grows to handle its fluctuating states. Importantly, physiological arousal, if too low or too high, will impede the possibility, will impede the imagination and polarize the imagination into certainty states, into concrete problem solving, or into a kind of disjointed or decoupled way of talking about things, as if the biggest things in one's life had really no effect on the person. So what we call pretend mode, which is not pretending, but which is a decoupling of the emotion that is narrated and the emotion that is lived about the narration. And so arousal is going to be something that we are going to try to follow very attentively in our interventions. And in doing so, we are going to try, first of all, to attend to arousal in the here and now, so at every moment of the exchange, but also have a bit of our mind that is specifically attending to the caller's experience of the world, seeing the world through the eyes of the patient as the artificial intelligence is trying to copy us, but it's not achieving it for now. So at the first level, in the here and now, this really concerns you and the possibility to attend to fluctuating arousal within yourself in the face of the callers, what they're saying and what they're confronting you to. This arousal will challenge your posture of not knowing, your curiosity about how the caller sees the world, about what they're experiencing. It might lead you off of your usual listening skills. It might give you a very urgent desire to give a solution, to argue with the patient or with the caller, or to act a bit like in the example of the AI, okay? It's losing its emotional capacity to contain the moment and to stay with the emotion of the patient and is very quickly reverting to solutions that actually are off the mark, are off the point of why this person is calling you. The second level that we think is useful in therapeutic communication is to try to help or make the person feel what you feel and understand about what it is to be in their shoes. Okay, that's a bit complicated. But the question for us is not so much what do you say to someone for them to feel understood or to understand what's going on with them, but rather how and what do you say to someone to make them feel that you're trying to understand what they're experiencing. And so this is the how of the mentalizing process, which is going to entail a lot of regulating for you. It's also going to entail a lot of embodied reflections. You need a body to say these things, not an algorithm. You need a body because, as I told you in the first place, the body is also sending signals to engage in synchrony as you are mentalizing, as you are using the verbal part of your brain. And this breeds psychological contact, and this is where we're going to link to trust. It also breeds epistemic trust. What is epistemic trust? It consists in the attribution of your trust, of your confidence in a source of knowledge. So why would somebody calling you trust that what you say is reliable? They're not going to fact check, right? Is relevant to them? And actually is generalizable beyond the episode that you're sharing. It's generable to their world understanding. Okay? Why would they trust you that way? How is it that they come to trust you in that way? Because you don't know them, they don't know you really. The important thing here is once epistemic trust needs to be maintained, it needs to be sustained, but what it does is that it affects the encoding of the information as information that is worth remembering, and it's going also to lead to reality testing. So that piece of information will then be tested in the caller's actual real-world experience. You see this happen in people that go to therapy. They come to trust their therapist, and then for a while they're testing the information that they're learning about themselves onto you or onto other people. The last thing they heard about what their therapist said, they're going to test it out. Okay, this is the process of epistemic trust. They're testing the value of that information to understand the world. How generalizable is this information? And so epistemic trust is a concept that comes from developmental psychology around our need to communicate information that can be ready to use, in a sense. Many things that you know, you didn't actually learn how it was built, how it works, why it works that way. It has epistemic opacity. But you trust the source of the information that gives you that information, then you use it. Okay? Transmitting this type of information, and you will notice that you yourself use ostensive cues of communication. If you see the person, you're going to use eye contact in your communication. This is nonverbal. Especially on the phone, you're going to be very aware of the timing of turn-taking in a conversation. You're going to want to react contingently. If somebody says something about an important information, you're not going to wait 35 seconds to react to it. You're going to be contingently reactive emotionally when significant emotions pop up. You're going to adjust your tone. Okay, you're going to tune in to the affective realm of the caller. All of these ostensive cues of communication have an important effect on the attention system, either of the child or the caller. What it communicates to them is that I take you seriously. I am listening to what you have to say. You are a worthy social communication partner. That breeds a sense of agency. That brings a sense of what we would call the I mode. I exist in the eyes or in the ears and the mind of the person who is receiving the call. And what these ostensive cues foster is epistemic trust, meaning that what you will say to them then will become meaningful, will become a piece of information that can lead to sharing of knowledge, knowledge about emotions, perhaps knowledge about how relationships works, perhaps knowledge about how the world works, how they work in the world, and then they can go and test it out in the world. They can generalize it. But of course, this is going to be a dynamic process as well, because every caller will be in a state of wishing to believe you, but also of vigilance. What are you going to say about them? They can wish to believe so much that they become credule, that they engage in credulity, which is not going to help you in your intervention. But they could also engage in such vigilance that they become mistrustful, that they can become suspicious. Okay, so epistemic trust and the way that the back and forth of these contingent cues, communicative cues, of this mentalizing process, and of the synchrony are all in a dynamic during a call, where the caller presents a self-narrative and has a way to think about herself, a way which the listener will try to convey impressions about what they're getting, because they have very little information. They have tone of voice, a couple of words, a couple of minutes to go on to reflect this. And this is what AI can't do, I think, is that in the meantime, the caller is imagining you thinking about them. And they're actually evaluating how much what they're perceiving of you thinking about them corresponds to how they're living themselves. This is called the epistemic match. And that epistemic match is what will either increase epistemic trust or decrease when there's a mismatch, epistemic trust. And once we can entertain a process where we play around the epistemic match, we open the gateway for the knowledge, the transmission of social knowledge. So to conclude, I'm very Swiss. You can't see this, but there's 1 minute left on my timer. So the train will arrive at the right time. I just need to blah blah a bit so that I arrive at 00. So what I tried to tell you today is that one way to think about what you're doing, but also one way to think about what happens when it all doesn't go quite right, is that our therapeutic communication rests on 3 essential pillars, and there's not one that is more important than the other. Biobehavioral synchrony, that is going to necessitate a lot of non-verbal attunement. Mentalizing process, which is going to be the back and forth of figuring out what it is that it is to experience in the person's shoes, but also managing arousal so that it's not too low nor too high. And epistemic trust, which is about sharing these worldviews in a way that the caller's experience is someone who's actually listening to them and seeing them. And I understand won't do it. It won't be enough. I see what you're saying, I am like you sometimes. Won't be enough sometimes. We'll have to mentalize, figure out what it is that needs to be exchanged here to provide that experience which is going to diminish mistrust and enhance epistemic trust. And that epistemic trust will then lead to generalization, and we hope a rekindling of trust with the people that are actually around them, and that could provide this kind of relationship. I thank you for listening.